Hey everyone, Pastor George here with our mailbag question for today, and today we got a deep but clearly cheeky question for mailbag. And so the question that I got, and I'm going to explain all these terms because I imagine that most people when they see this are not going to understand at all what this question means. And so uh, the person wrote, "Does liberation theologians Weltanschauung embrace an amillennialist eschatology?" First of all, I'd like to apologize for my German pronunciation. I will say that my German isn't non-existent. Uh, it's as close to non-existent as you can, but I actually do know a few phrases and words and kind of, I would never say I could speak it, but I can say some things. So, but my pronunciation is garbage, and so I'd like to apologize for the way I say Weltanschauung. But anyway, so I'm going to explain all these terms first. So, because obviously, those of you who are looking at this probably don't even know what any of this means. Maybe some of it, not all of it, or unless you've studied this type of stuff, in which case, congrats, you don't have a lot of time on your hands. You don't have a lot of things to do. You have a lot of time on your hands. So firstly, a liberation theology. We talked a little bit about liberation theology in one of our classes last spring when we looked at how to read the Bible and the way that certain people will look at different things. But liberation theology is a 20th century theology coming from the 1960s, starting in Latin America, but pretty quickly began to be used in the Northern Hemisphere as well. And liberation theology is ultimately a political theology, which talks about God's preference for the poor. That's the word that was used by that is used often. Preference for the poor. That phrase is used often in liberation theology, and what it means is that Jesus Christ is yes seen as the Messiah. I mean, it really depends. They're all over the place, but primarily one who is here to bring freedom to those people who are oppressed, whether it's the poor, whether it's the people in prison, people under unjust systems, right? This is the way that those theologians talk about it. And because of that, like I said, it's primarily political. That's why you see it used mostly by people who have sympathies with like Marxist thinking and things like that in order to combine kind of Christian ethos with Marx's push against systems that he believes targets the poor, right, and targets people who are below society. And so there are lots of most famous theologians in the United States. Probably the most famous one is Cone, James Cone, who was a black liberation theologian, who's wrote a famous book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And so anyway, what it means that they're political is that they're very focused on the here and now. So there's very little emphasis on like evangelism because that's usually seen as part of these evil systems and stuff like that. So liberation theology is a political theology that is mainly focused around goals of helping people leave systems of oppression and all the baggage, all the Marxist baggage that claims, and then seeing Jesus as that is his primary goal, right? I have come to proclaim freedom to the captives, Jesus says, right? And so you can see how people would say, well, hey, maybe a more traditional Christian reading of that would be they're talking about freedom of captives, and what that means is freedom of the soul, right? But a liberation theologian is saying, no, this is like against the prison industrial complex, something like that, right? While they might also affirm the soul thing, some wouldn't. And so he says, does liberation theologian, so someone who believes liberation theology, teaches that, Weltanschauung, and this is clearly just used to be annoying, because this is just the German word for worldview. And in academics and in other areas, people like to use German. Like the three languages that are used is like French, German, and Latin. And if you want to show off how smart you are, you'll use that. So like I do this. So I'll use the word zeitgeist sometimes, which is spirit of the age. Although I will say that it's a better to say zeitgeist than spirit of the age because it's not like a one-to-one translation. It's like more of like trying to get the point across. Regardless, Weltanschauung literally just means worldview. So I don't know why other than to be ostentatious. And so the last is does liberation theologians Weltanschauung embrace an amillennialist eschatology? So just those two words. Eschatology is the part of Christian theology that talks about the end times. The eschaton is when Jesus will return, and so well, the eschaton is the time period when Jesus will return, I suppose, if you want to be very technical about what it means. And then the amillennialist refers to one of the ways that people view the timing of when Jesus is going to return. And so you have premillennialists who believe that Jesus is going to come before 1,000 years. Remember in Revelation, it talks about 1,000 years, right? So some people believe that he's going to come before 1,000 years and rule, put in a good rule for 1,000 years, and then the end times will come. Postmillennialists, postmillennialists believe after 1,000 years Jesus is going to come and institute his rule, and 1,000 years of tribulation. And then amillennialists kind of see this not as a literal thing that John was talking about, but more of an idea, and that it's not as focused on one thing. This doesn't usually carry any baggage, although this is mostly a modern theologian thing, like 20th century people arguing about this. The traditional stance of much of the church has been amillennialism, which is that we don't really know when it's going to happen, and so we're not too concerned with parsing out whether or not Jesus is going to come before or after, right? So it's very pointed. But what I think this person's question does the things that a liberation theologian's view of the world, does that inherently mean they'll have an amillennialist view of eschatology? And the answer to that is, yeah, I think so. And the reason I think so is because liberation theology is so focused on the physical, right? The physical needs of people in this world. And in my conversations with people who are really into liberation theology, there is actually, I would say they actually might not embrace any eschatology, in the sense that, depending on where they are in the spectrum, some might just say, well, Christianity, it's more metaphorical, like Jesus isn't really going to come back. It's more of like a personal resurrection, that sort of thing. And from what I've seen from a lot of liberation theologians, is that there is no end to liberation. It goes on forever. So there is actually no end goal. This is one of my really big critiques with it. Liberation never ends. And because they have this idea that liberation never ends, that to me implies that Christ will never return. And so I would almost say it's an anti-millennialist rather than an amillennialist. But I suppose for those who still believe that Christ will return, they would take an amillennialist stance, believing that there might be a time when Christ returns, but it certainly isn't going to be followed by maybe 1,000 years of Christ instituted socialism, or after 1,000 years of bad capitalism or something like that, right? I think it's mostly just like Christ will return, and that'll happen. Liberation theology, unlike a lot of others, it can range the spectrum in terms of how orthodox the actual adherents of it are. I view this isn't a condemnation of everyone. So if you're into it and you're like, I believe that Jesus raised from the dead, that's great. Wonderful. Good. But a lot of the liberation theologians that I've interacted with on paper, and a lot of the people who I've engaged with who subscribe to it, usually don't really care about orthodox Christian teaching. They usually care more about the political engagement and Jesus as a political figure. And I think that ends up really harming their case, which is why there's a famous quote that liberation theologians brought their theology, or offered South America their theology, and South America chose Pentecostalism. It's a famous quote. I can't remember who said that, but that's what happened, or charismatics, charismatism, whatever that is. That's what South America chose instead. So it's getting at this idea of there's this homebrewed theology from South America that was offered to people, but people didn't take it because liberation theology isn't very compelling, in which I would agree. All right, everyone, you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Sorry that was very academic, but that's the nature of the question. Hopefully you were able to follow along with that. And if you want to have follow-up questions, you can send them to me. Keep sending me more questions. I guess I do have a few in the pipeline, but because some of you did my birthday present, but not all of you. So I'm still waiting for cash and Steam gift cards and or questions. So send them to me. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and peace out.